Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're playing for you right now some earlier testimony in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Mr. Grate is now in his sentencing phase. For anybody that doesn't know about this case or anybody that was following this case, here's where we're at. We covered this case here at Law and Crime. We covered his trial. Mr. Grate was convicted of murdering two women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, as well as abducting and raping a third woman who's chosen to be unidentified. We just refer to her as Jane Doe. Now, that same jury that convicted him across the board, and he was found guilty on 23 counts in that indictment. Now, it should be noted Mr. Grate, in the middle of that trial, pled guilty to 15 of those 23 counts. Now that same jury has to determine what will happen to him. This is his sentencing phase, and they have four options. They could either choose 25 years in prison, 25 years to life in prison, 30 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. The death penalty is really the main issue here, and the defense will do anything in their power to see that their client is not voted in favor of the death penalty. And some of the ways that they're doing it is trying to garner sympathy from the jury, or trying to make this man who has done who has been convicted of heinous crimes, trying to make him more human. We saw the testimony earlier of Barbara Charter, who is the defendant's sister, talking about their upbringing and what Mr. Grate suffered or what he went through as a child. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I have a very special guest with me right now, attorney and former juvenile court judge, Ashley Willcott. Ashley, it's good to see you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Now, I love your perspective on this, and I should let our viewers and listeners know they're in a quick break in the Grate case, but as soon as we have the feed, we'll make sure to go back to it. In your experience as a former juvenile court judge, listening to this testimony from his sister that Mr. Grate had a traumatic childhood, he acted out a lot, had a really disruptive family, his grandmother shot his grandfather, he had a tumor in his arm that debilitated him from playing sports. What do you make of it?
Listen, those are all terrible things that happen to him, and abuse and neglect of children is a really terrible thing, and it traumatizes, it affects their brain development. But you have to weigh that against everything he's been convicted of, the crimes that he's admitted to. You have numerous victims. You have horrific crimes, including 2 aggravated murders of these victims. And you have, he admitted to a previous incident of raping an individual. And so when you look at the totality of the circumstances and all of that, is the jury really going to find that his childhood are mitigating enough factors not to give him the death penalty? I don't know.
In your experience, people that are convicted of these kind of crimes, heinous crimes. We're talking about 2 decomposed bodies that were found in his house. What are the factors? What are the defense? What's the one way that they can convince the jurors, you know what, he really shouldn't be found, you shouldn't vote in favor of the death penalty? What kind of cases have you seen where the defense has done something and it worked?
Sure. So let me just clarify. I still sit as a judge part-time. And so in that experience and seeing trials come before me, here's the number one thing that's going to work with the jury: sympathy. Sympathy for that defendant any way that you can prove it. So in this case, they're trying to paint a picture of his horrible childhood and what happened to him and the trauma it caused. And any sympathy that they can garner can convince a jury to say, you know what, not the death penalty. Instead, he needs to serve life in prison or 25 plus years or no possibility of parole, or the other 3 options that they have.
Ashley Willcott and I are examining the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, this convicted murderer who is now facing his sentencing hearing. The same jury that convicted him has to determine what will happen to him, and that's the potential of the death penalty. One of the other interesting things, Ashley, is Mr. Grate's brain. I mean, we talk about the brain of defendants a lot, what was going on in his mind. We believe the defense is going to call Dr. John Fabian, a character, if you look up this case, keeps coming up. This is a psychologist who is going to talk about the mental diseases or defects of Shawn Grate. How is that going to play into this case?
So that's what they're going to try to do, is they're really going to try to say that he lacks the capacity, right, to understand the criminality and that the fact of what he did were crimes. That is going to play in the case. It depends on that expert's testimony and how much weight a jury decides to give to that expert. The issue I have is when anyone engages in this many horrific crimes against numerous perpetrators. Is that expert opinion going to weigh enough for a jury to take it into account and say, all right, his brain's not working correctly, that's not his fault? Again, sympathy. I don't know.
Yeah, it's something to see, and this is the case, the prime case, to see if it works. As they wait to go back for trial to begin again, or as the case to begin, the hearing to begin again, I want to play our viewers and our listeners some more of the testimony from Shawn Grate's sister. This was earlier, talking more about what his upbringing was like, what he was like as a young man, as a young child, and did any of that have an influence upon him in doing what he did today? Let's listen in. This is more of the sister's testimony. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network at Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Thanks for joining us. We're covering the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, a man who was convicted of murdering 2 women and abducting and raping a third. He's also been convicted of raping one of those murdered victims as well. What we're looking at right now, what we're covering right now, is his sentencing hearing. That's right. The same jury that convicted him now has to determine what his punishment will ultimately be. And what are they hearing today? They're hearing from the defense a number of witnesses, or at least we've heard one, we believe more will be called, trying to show sympathy for the defendant, and even despite the crimes that he committed, why he should not be eligible for the death penalty, why they should not vote in favor of the death penalty. I want to bring on back my special guest, attorney and former juvenile court judge Ashley Willcott. Now, there are 4 options for the jury here. Death penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole, or 25 years to life in prison, or 30 years to life in prison. How would the jury, I find those last 2 not to be likely, 25 years, 30 years. What would make them vote in favor of that?
Again, it's going to be the sympathy factor, and do they hear enough evidence through the defense witnesses today that's not offset by any state witnesses to say, okay, he didn't have the ability to understand, again, the criminology of his actions and the fact that those were crimes. I don't think that's going to happen in this case, in my opinion, but that's what the jury would have to feel and believe based on the evidence presented for testimony for sentencing in order to actually give him the 25 years plus or the 30 years plus.
Well, Ashley, I've been surprised before, and maybe I'll be surprised again. Let's see. We have a live feed into the Shawn Grate courtroom. The next witness is on the stand. Let's listen in live. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening and watching to a live feed right there in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, a convicted murderer who now is, this is his sentencing hearing. The same jury that convicted him of murdering 2 women and abducting and raping a third is now, they have to determine what his punishment will be. And the maximum punishment is the death penalty. The defense will do anything in their power to make sure that doesn't happen, and one of the ways they're doing that is now bringing on the stand Dr. John Fabian, a neuropsychologist who studied the defendant's brain. I talked about this a little bit with my guest, attorney and juvenile court judge Ashley Willcott. So as we're listening to his credentials right now and his background, and as soon as we go back into the courtroom when he gets into the meat of the Shawn Grate case, we're listening to this and trying to understand what disorders, what exact disorders are we looking for here from Dr. John Fabian that might hold sway with the jury?
So the law provides, number 1, is there a mental disease or defect? So for instance, I suspect you might hear testimony about a tumor or any type of brain injury like that. And that can cause, obviously, a change to the brain and the inability mentally to know that what you're doing is a crime, or be able to, they're going to argue that it's not deliberate, premeditated crimes that he committed, but instead that he doesn't have the ability to recognize and realize this was wrong. And in that vein, try to mitigate and convince the jury, again, sympathy, this is why he did it, so he should not receive the death penalty.
And does that work?
I've seen it work. Yes, I have seen it work. And so it is absolutely a possibility. The second part that Dr. Fabian would have to testify to is that, again, this defendant, Shawn Grate, lacks the capacity. He lacks the mental capacity to appreciate that he committed offenses that were crimes. And so depending on how well this testimony goes, it could potentially convince this jury that this man should not be sentenced to death.
We've been waiting for his testimony. For anybody who's been following this case, Dr. John Fabian, we've been waiting for it. As he goes into his background and his credentials and what his studies are, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going straight back into the Shawn Grate case, and we can learn a little bit more about this serial killer's brain. We'll be back in a minute. Hey, I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We're covering the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. We have a live feed in that case. This is the sentencing hearing for a convicted serial killer, a man, Shawn Grate, who was found guilty of killing 2 women and abducting and raping a third. Now, what's happening is the sentencing phase. The same jury that convicted him has to determine what his punishment will be, and the death penalty is on the table. On the stand right now is Dr. John Fabian, a neuropsychologist who is being brought forth by the defense to talk a little bit more about the defendant's brain. What was his mental makeup? Did he suffer from a mental disease or disorder that prevented him from complying with the law? If so, will that garner some sympathy from the jury, some understanding from the jury, and saying, well, maybe this defendant really couldn't control his actions. He deserves life in prison, but he doesn't deserve to be killed. Let's learn a little bit more about this from Dr. John Fabian. This is a live feed into the Shawn Grate case. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Shawn Grate case, a convicted serial killer who is now in his sentencing hearing. The same jury that convicted him for killing 2 women and abducting and raping a third now has to determine if he's eligible, if they want to vote in favor of the death penalty, because that's on the table. I want to bring back in Ashley Willcott, who is our esteemed guest for today, attorney and juvenile court judge. We were listening, again, our viewers and listeners, we have eye on the live feed in the courtroom. Dr. John Fabian, a neuropsychologist, is on the stand, but he's just going through his background right now. As soon as he gets into the meat of this case, we'll jump back live. But Ashley, we were listening before to the testimony of the defendant's sister, and you always want to hear from family members of the defendant to learn a little bit more about their makeup and what they did as a young child. Here, I think the prosecutor made a good point and said, despite all of the things that happened to Mr. Grate, wasn't it his choice at the end of the day what kind of person he would be?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say about that testimony. There are regrettably the statistics around how many children are abused, neglected, not loved in their home, not shown sympathy, shown the kind of lifestyle that the sister described is statistically a large number of children. And so, I mean, I can tell you this, 1 out of every 4 children sexually abused. Does that mean that all of those children are going to grow up to be adults that perpetrate, that are criminal offenders, that are convicted, that admit to heinous crimes like this defendant did? No, it doesn't. And so there's a very good argument to be made by the state that, look, in spite of that childhood, the sister's fine. That doesn't mean that this man had any right or was entitled to commit these heinous crimes.
So in other words, we keep talking about it, this is just the sympathy plea, right? It's not saying this excuses his behavior, because I've heard people who've gone through worse childhoods and they've grown up to be commendable people in society. So again, this is all sympathy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when does that work? When does that work?
I've seen it work, because think about this, you know, the jury, a jury of your peers, and they're all going to think a little bit differently. And some are going to think, hey, yes, he did these crimes. We already know that. We already have the conviction. So that's a done deal. But I'm sympathetic to the fact that he had this horrible childhood and these things were awful. And you have to have a unanimous decision. And so it may be that 1 or 2 of these jurors are going to buy into the sympathy. Again, it's not necessarily what I expect in this trial. But as you've already pointed out, Jesse, you never know what a jury's going to do.
I've been surprised before. I might be surprised again. Ashley, stand by. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump live into the court. Dr. John Fabian is on the stand, a neuropsychologist that examined the brain of the defendant. Let's go live. All right, everybody. So we have to cut out of that testimony because we're going to go to our break. Remember, this is the Shawn Grate case that we're covering here on Law and Crime. Shawn Grate, a convicted murderer who now is his sentencing phase. What will be his punishment? And Dr. John Fabian, who's on the stand right now, is being brought forth by the defense as a mitigation expert, mitigation evidence, trying to show, let's analyze the defendant's brain. Did he suffer from a certain mental disease or defect? And if that's true, perhaps that lessens the effect of the punishment, and perhaps the jury will come back with life in prison and not the death penalty. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Hello there, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We are covering the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. This is a convicted murderer who is now facing his sentencing phase. The same jury that convicted him of murdering 2 women and abducting and raping a third now has to determine if he is eligible for the death penalty. Will they find him that they vote in favor of the death penalty, or will it be something less, like life in prison? Right now on the stand is Dr. John Fabian. This is a forensic psychologist brought forth by the defense to talk about the mental makeup of the defendant and if he suffered from a mental disease or defect. Let's listen in live. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're watching and listening to the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, a convicted murderer, a man who was convicted by a jury of his peers for killing two women, and abducting and raping a third. Now is his sentencing phase. What will he be sentenced to? He faces the death penalty. Dr. John Fabian is on the stand, brought forth by the defense to talk about the mental makeup of the defendant. And he talked about some of the disorders that he believes Mr. Grate may suffer from. And the first thing that he looked at was his upbringing, and he had a traumatic childhood. He had a terrible relationship with his mother, and he even talked about the fact that he wanted to kill his mother at some points. Really disturbing stuff. I want to bring back in attorney and juvenile court judge Ashley Willcott. Ashley, you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
The saga with the mother gets worse and worse. He had fantasies about killing her?
Right. So, one of this expert's jobs, because he investigated and he's an expert for the mitigating circumstances or factors, is to tell the life story of Shawn Grate. And here's what he's doing. And he's saying, listen, he had a traumatic childhood. There were a lot of things wrong with his childhood. He had a love-hate relationship with his mother. He even wanted to kill her. So he's trying to say, take all these factors into account, jury. The other thing I think where he's going to go with this, Jesse, is to say, listen, when you have a lot of trauma as a child, it affects your brain development. Scientists know that now. It's proven, and it can affect the way your brain develops and functions, which is ultimately where he's going to go with his testimony, I think.
I can't wait to see where this testimony goes. We're going to take a quick break in this case. When we come back, we'll be live in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Stay tuned. 2 women and abducting and raping a third. Now that same jury has to determine what his punishment will be, and it's possible it could be the death penalty. He's death penalty eligible. On the stand right now is Dr. John Fabian, a forensic psychologist who was tasked with studying the brain, the mental makeup of the defendant. Let's go live into the courtroom. Everybody, I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We're looking at the Shawn Grate case, a convicted serial killer, a man who was convicted of killing 2 women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, as well as abducting and raping a third woman, unidentified. We just identify her as Jane Doe. After convicting him, that jury now has to determine what his punishment will be, and the death penalty is on the table. We're learning from Dr. John Fabian, a forensic psychologist who's on the stand, all the different disorders that, in his opinion, Mr. Grate suffers from. I want to talk about this more. Hopefully my guest is still with me. Ashley Willcott, attorney and juvenile court judge. Are you still with me?
I am.
Ashley, great, perfect. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that Mr. Grate suffers from some different disorders. What do you make of it?
Well, let's talk about what those are. So far, it's been diagnosed as mild depressive condition by history. So keep in mind that's mild. He said maybe it's severe now, but as a child, mild depressed. The other thing significant is that he said he specifically did not diagnose this defendant with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but instead complex trauma and with learning disabilities. So far in the grand scheme of things, the diagnoses are not so significant that you think, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a laundry list of diagnoses. In fact, when he said, he goes, you want me to go through all of them right now, indicating, if I was listening to it, makes it seem like there's a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting set of scenarios. I've seen these kind of hearings happen a lot. I've seen them not work in the defendant's favor a lot of times. I've seen it sometimes work in the defendant's favor. It's interesting to see which way it goes. Ashley, I know our time together is coming to an end. So final thoughts on this case as we reflect on it right now.
I hope your viewers will stay tuned because I think it's fascinating. I'm a trial nerd, but I'm just saying this expert, so far, I do not feel like it's been a huge revelation to say, wow, they're clearly mitigating circumstances and this defendant should not get the death penalty. And instead, I think that they're slowly having to grab at straws, and I don't know what the final picture is that this expert's going to paint. So I can't wait to keep watching, and I appreciate you, Jesse.
I appreciate you too. Let me just ask you one final question. You think he's going to be found, they're going to go to the death penalty? The jury will vote in favor of the death penalty?
Honestly, I do. I do. Based on the facts of the crimes and, at this point, lack of mitigating circumstances, I sure do.
Ashley Willcott, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you having on.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So we are going to go back live into the Shawn Grate case. Again, Mr. Grate is a convicted killer who is now facing the death penalty. This is his sentencing hearing. Dr. John Fabian, a psychologist, is on the stand talking about the disorders of the defendant. Let's go live.
My testimony.